everybody. Thank you again for those who have come back and those have stayed in the last 5 minutes after our little computer snafus. What we're going to do is we're going to talk about part 2 of our seminar series, Digital Evidence from a Twinkle in Your Eye to the End of the Trial. And for those who are joining us for the first time, the first 3 for the first 3 topics of this 2-part seminar basically is we're covering how to know what digital evidence is out there, is how to know what digital evidence is out there, how to properly collect it. So we talked about search warrants and consent and getting electronic records, and then also how to search the devices. So Adam talked about how to get data off of a phone, and we talked about how to get social media records and other records from electronic service providers. So today we're going to talk about part 2 is two topics. Now that you've got it and can read it, what can you do with it, which is basically the concept of how do you analyze the data that you now have. And then the last topic is, now that you've analyzed it, how do you effectively present it at trial? And I think we can go to the next slide. So topic 4, as I indicated, you need to know how to analyze the data. You can get all the data in the world off of a phone, off of a social media account, off of call detail records, and it's not going to do you any good unless you know what you're looking at and you know how it meshes with each other. Go ahead with the next slide. In criminal cases, 5 entities generally are the ones that will potentially analyze the data. Basically, depending on how your setup is in your jurisdiction, you're going to have a forensic examiner. You're going to have the person who pulls out the data from the device, or the person you're going to have the investigator that submits the search warrant for the social media records. Sometimes they're the same person. Adam in our office is both a forensic examiner and an investigator and a detective. And so he does both the extraction of the data, he does the search warrants, and he also investigates, and he uses that data. As we're going to hear more in a few minutes from Chris, then we get, and we were very, very lucky here in Denver to have Chris as our crime analyst. He's an amazing crime analyst. The things that he can do with spreadsheets and figure out where people have been and what they're thinking and what they're seeing and what they've done based on all the data is just amazing. So we're going to be able to hear some of that here soon. The other entities that will potentially analyze data in a digital evidence case, or a case that has digital evidence, is an expert. If you have evidence that is being challenged, you may have a situation where you need to bring in a private expert. And then the last situation is the last party that's going to be doing analyzing the data is the prosecutor or the defense attorney. And Matt's going to talk a little bit about how, when he gets a case, how he analyzes the case with the digital data and how he assesses those cases.
So some of us are incredibly lucky to have Adams and Chris's in our office, and officers, detectives who are able to look for digital evidence. Generally, when I get a case, it's a case where either there just is no digital evidence and there's really no prospect for that, or more likely, I feel, and more nowadays, are cases where I either have some piece of digital evidence already in my case, either from the detective or the crime analyst. That's one subset. And then the other one is a case that in reviewing the case, I believe that we can get some type of digital evidence. So that's essentially what I look for. I have the cases where it's already been, a phone has already been dumped or something like that, and it's already in my case, or a case where I'm looking at getting the detective on board for writing up a warrant and getting into a phone, or having an analyst or an investigator at our office look at Facebook or social media or something like that. But more and more, I feel nowadays, every single case that we look at, you know, one of those check boxes that I go through is, what can I look for with digital evidence?
Okay, and one of the things I want to point out, sorry, I just was reading a little comment. It's also relevant, is it not, when you have a case, and let's say as the case progresses and you find out later during the case that they're going to raise, let's say, a claim of self-defense, or they're going to raise a claim of insanity or a particular kind of defense, that evidence may not have been necessary. It may not have been necessary to pull the social media records or to dump the phone, but now it does make it relevant because there might be evidence relevant to that particular defense. So that's something to think about when you're a prosecutor or defense attorney and you're looking at this, analyzing the data for your cases. Okay, next slide.
All right, so this is Chris, and those are great introductions from everybody. And I do a lot of the digital evidence analysis within the office. It's similar to what I was doing when I was at the police department. So the first thing when I'm provided with the records to go through and start analyzing them is I need to know what it is that I'm looking for. What is it that the case hopes to capture within those records? Many times it's location. That's kind of a big thing. Where was something that happened, and where was the person that committed it or allegedly had committed it? Many times it's also the communications. As we work through a lot of other cases, it's who's talking to who's making communication from one party to another. We also look at financial transactions, because money is always a good motivator for various crimes. And then on top of that, we also look at the social media, other internet accounts, and then obviously photographs and videos. Those are all information that we receive from search warrant returns. We can receive those from a phone extraction, or we can also receive those directly from the carriers. The source of the information and the investigative question do help to narrow down the focus when we're searching through large amounts of data. In a couple of cases that I've worked, we've had upwards of 10 phones and all the communication records over the course of a year. If you think about how often you use your phone and you multiply that by 10, and we're looking for one little piece of that in order to move forward with the investigation. I like the little picture that I put into the slide here. It's a picture of somebody being very excited at finding the needle in the haystack. That's kind of what the job is sometimes, is looking for that needle in the haystack, but at the same time, we can't remember all the other information that's contained within the haystack. Next slide, please. So with all of that, how we analyze the data is really dependent upon the source of that we're working with. If we're working with a cell phone extraction, then we'll have a lot of different information between text messages, voice calls, databases that tell us how the phone was being operated, internet search history, and so on. Now that information is perishable because users can delete it, so we may want to take a look at other sources in order to backstop the information that we're looking for. If we're looking at a computer, a tablet, or external media, those sometimes will have communications. Many times it's mostly just the pictures. Call detail records have been being used upwards of 20 years now in lots of different cases, so we all know the value on those. Other location information is a huge assistance when working some of these cases. We have to kind of think about where can we get other location information. Are there Google records that your target has been using that will provide GPS collected by Google? Does the social media from Facebook have something, or Twitter? Where else can we maybe get some of those location informations on top of the communications records? And you may not think about it, but a bank account or bank statements, those also have location information, because you'll get the location of the bank where money is being deposited, or the ATM where the money is being deposited or withdrawn. So again, we start to kind of piece this picture together. Next slide, please. So we kind of talked about multiple data sources that we're using in order to conduct our investigation. And even though we have a lot of different sources, there may be some crossover between the data where you'll get similar information from multiple sources. Things like that can be location information. You obviously get those out of the call detail records. We also see it many times in the phone extraction report, whether the device is collecting GPS on where the phone was, or EXIF data from pictures that were sent via text message or other methods of texting it back and forth. And then also social media, while it's collecting information at the carrier or at the carrier level, that information may also be located on the phone itself. Social media messages, we may see those within the social media account itself, but also within the device we can find them, and we would hope to find them in a search warrant as well. And then photographs and remnants of photographs, we can find those on various devices. We can find those in a cloud return or in another external drive or another computer. So we just want to make sure that we're kind of trying to get a full range of all the data sources that are going to help to answer our question. Next slide, please. So we have to we're constantly looking at the tools that we have, and that's one of the main functions of me, is to determine what tools do we have to analyze the data, because every carrier and every company and every system is a little bit different. They present their data differently. There's a lot of companies out there that will provide a variety of tools that will help you to analyze the data, to get it to a point where you can read it. And when you're talking about multiple carriers, if you're thinking you're using Sprint versus AT&T or Verizon, getting those records into a consistent format all the way through a reformatting process is going to greatly assist with the investigation in determining who's in contact with who, times, dates, and then locations. There's many specialized software packages that will assist with that. We use 2 or 3 different software packages at times, depending on what it is that we're looking at. Some of the common challenges that we run into when we're analyzing data, and I'm sure you've all run into this before, is date and time formatting. Have the records been provided to us in universal coordinated time or local time? If a phone is, we had a case several years ago where the crime happened in Denver, but the suspect, eventually defendant, was arrested in Louisiana. When we took his phone, because it registered with the network, it then registered into Central Time. So all the information that we had as far as time and date needed to be reformatted so we could take a look at it in local time. Records that are provided in PDF format present an especially challenging function because of the nature of a PDF. It's difficult to read through, it's difficult to parse out. However, again, there are software packages out there that will go through, read the PDF, and then recode the PDF into a format that's more legible. And then the last one is really the records that are provided in formats that Windows can't read natively. Probably the largest one that I see the most often is Google Gmail return. It comes in a format called Mbox, and we have to use different type of software packages to get into that in order to read through the emails and collect some of the other information out of there. Next slide, please. So there's best ways to view and analyze the data. At least what I found is how I want to look at the data when I'm working through it. And I'm always looking at what can I do to get the most of the data to get the most out of it that's in front of me. Do I want to answer all those other questions? Are there multiple questions that we're looking at? And as I work through a case, I'm always adding new relevant information into a variety of timelines or a variety of maps and graphs and things like that. We work constantly with the investigators, the lawyers in the office, and other analysts around the region here in order to build a picture. So the little graph that we see on the side is kind of an intelligence workflow. It's a part of the intelligence cycle where we've got planning and direction, collection, analysis, dissemination, and feedback. That's a loop that we work with in our investigations, and the graph isn't really this particular one isn't really the best because at any point we can move back and forth. So in a typical case within the office, I will receive the information, analyze the data, come up with some new questions, provide that back to either the investigators or the attorneys so that we can either find additional data or they can look at their investigative theory. Next slide, please. So this is an example of some of the work that I've performed in the past, these two graphs, and you can see that combining and charting the data can highlight new information. These particular records that you're looking at are link charts. They're based on call detail records. There's two different ones. The top one is one case and the bottom is another case. As you can see, by taking the 3 target phone numbers in one case, we can plot them, take a look and see if there's any additional connections between the 3 parties. In that particular case, we couldn't see any connections. That helps us with our investigative theory to move into into a different realm. On the bottom one, you can see that there's several connections. I know they're kind of small, but you can see that there's several common connections between 4 different phones that we didn't know about. What that does is that it reveals that there's previously unknown connections, and then it's up to the investigators or the detectives to determine what those connections mean and what they are. Many times those types of connections uncover additional witnesses. They can uncover additional suspects, or if we're looking at doing a more global social networking, we can look at different places to interrupt various criminal activity. Additionally, it's an easy way to very quickly prove or disprove a party's knowledge of another person. If you have multiple contacts between 2 parties and you see that, and they say they don't know that person, then you can ask them why their devices have been in contact with each other as frequently as they may have been. So some of the packages that we use, and I'm not advocating for one or the over another, these are just some that we use, that I use consistently in our investigations. This one here, this is called I2 Analyst Notebook. What this does is allows me to take various spreadsheets and graphs, put them into the software, and create these link chart pictures. From there, I can do filtering, I can move things around, and I can also build out timelines. So if I'm looking at communications between a variety of phones, I can look at a timeline of what those communications look like. I can also use the software to insert other things, such as events, if I want to look at how these people potentially relate to a robbery series, for example, or how they relate to a series of gunshots. The software will assist with that. Next, please. Now, last week, Adam had talked a little bit about the Cellbrite software that we use within the office in order to extract data off of phones. We also use Cellbrite Analytics in order to analyze the data to look and see what other information we can glean out of it. Cellbrite Analytics, the reason we went with that is because it provides some artificial intelligence that we can, it helps us to identify very quickly photographs and videos, also dictionary key terms that we include within the analysis, and then kind of rises those to the top so to focus us on the massive amounts of data that can be in a phone. Next, please. And, you know, a great main trusty tool that almost everybody should have is Excel, or at least some sort of comma separated value software. Excel is used very heavily. I provide a lot of my records back to the investigators and to detectives and to the attorneys in an Excel format, because everybody in the office can open it, so we don't have to purchase any new additional software. And we can also apply various formatting to it. One other benefit of that is that we can either apply filters, we can apply colors, so that when I'm looking at, if I'm looking at multiple targets, we can kind of make your eye look at different things. We can also add in dates, times, and the text of conversations if we have those, and then you can see what that conversation looks like in a chronological fashion. One of the tools that we use is also PLX, which will, when I spoke about reading PDF forms, many times your Facebook return will come in a PDF. That software will convert the Facebook return into a format that I can put into Excel. And now we're reading just those single conversations as we run down in a chronological fashion. And again, applying filters, we could look at just a conversation between 2 parties or see how conversations run. The other benefit of tools like these is that if I have multiple devices or multiple search warrant returns, I get them all into a consistent format. I have seen on cases where 2 parties will be in contact via text message. for whatever reason, they think that we can't get information from Facebook. So you'll see that the text messages will say, hey, let's move over to Facebook. We can then continue that conversation in the chronological fashion that we were used to prior to and not lose anything in the midst of it. Next, please. Now, this is cell site software that allows for the analysis of location information based on call detail records. This particular product is called CastViz. It's from the National Domestic Communications Assistance Center, who does provide training on how to use it and how to create these maps. This software is used pretty frequently by myself as well. I can take this information and build a file that can be opened by Google Maps and also present that back to the investigators and the attorneys as needed. So I want to give a couple of examples of how we've used these records. And one thing that I want to make sure that we don't forget about is the law enforcement records in your jurisdictions are a wealth of information. The information that is usually collected by police officers and sometimes by the prosecuting offices contain your street checks or your field interviews. They contain arrest records, and then on the prosecution side, those cases that have been filed. So a little bit of a kind of a backstory on what these two link charts show is several years ago, Denver had a robbery off of Colfax. And for those of you that don't know Colfax, it's one of the longest streets in the country. It runs through the middle of the two neighboring jurisdictions and also right through the middle of Denver. Two parties went in, they committed the robbery. They took one of the manager hostage for about 8 hours. Big standoff, eventually were both arrested. As I was working in robberies, I wanted to see what their connections looked like. So I took the records from our records management system, coded every contact that those two parties had, and then built these link charts. Within these link charts, we can see, it's hard to see them because they're so small, but each of those lines is a connection between one party and another party. And what I was able to find was essentially a fairly large robbery crew. The two arrows that you see that are in red, those are pointing to the same party in both of the charts. And the charts kind of tell a little bit different of a story on each of them, but that's how we, an assistance on how to read through the data. So those two arrows, like I said, they point at the same person. If we move forward a couple of years, we have another series of robberies in Denver. And we can move to this next slide, please. We have another series of robberies in Denver, and I get some information about some gunshots. I start looking at the gunshot case and see that there's this person named Antoine Wright that's named in it. And I start looking through his Facebook records. And this is another example of how we can use digital evidence in the investigative phase. And also this one went through a motions hearing. As you can see on the right, Mr. Jennings is in that gray jacket with the blue sleeves. You can see that there's 3 white stripes and 2 blue stripes on the cuff. And if you look at the surveillance image that's labeled as 2443 South University, that's robbery surveillance video from a robbery that he committed. We were able to extract this video, give it to the detectives, and that created a situation where one of the patrol sergeants, when I was at the police department, went and gave the information out at roll call. We waited for another robbery to get called out, and about 20 minutes after a subsequent robbery had been called with the same indicators, Mr. Wright was contacted and was also found to have proceeds from the robbery of that night and weapons, and was subsequently taken into custody. This particular case kind of holds a special place in my heart as we move forward, please. This didn't go to trial. We ended up in a motions hearing on the search of the Facebook. Defense was wanting to squash my search of Facebook as being an illegal search. We can talk about that a little bit later, but this is what the result of it was after my testimony and having to admit that I was friends with him on Facebook. He posted this very shortly after that hearing, and then the judge eventually ruled that the search was not illegal because Mr. Wright let me into his account, and also because if it wasn't his, which was another contention, then he didn't have a right to privacy anyway because it wasn't his account. So I just want to put that up there because these guys do know what we're doing, and they see it, and they still sometimes don't really pay much attention to it. Next slide, please. So I wanted to give some examples about some of the work that we've submitted. The next few slides, or this particular slide, is information that we presented at trial. What you see on the map here is the combination of multiple data sources into one package. And hopefully everybody can see it, but what you see is some wedge shapes. Those are actually the cell antennas and the directions those antennas were facing when the victim's phone, in this case, was being used. The green dots kind of towards the center, you have some labeled as 100 North Bannock Street. That's the crime location, and then the green dots surrounding that are a GPS device that was worn by one of the defendants in this case. As we further on, there's some more information about this case, and we'll show how we actually applied it at trial, and then we'll get a better idea of what something looks like as we put it in front of a jury. Next slide, please. One of the things that we always want to look at too, and we've done this several times in our office, is considering reprocessing the device and looking at the raw data if there's updates to any of the forensic tools that we use. With CELLPHONE in particular, there's various updates, and if there's a device that we weren't able to get into last year, that may have changed over the course of the year, so we may want to take a look at getting into it again. Or as we get closer to trial and various theories are presented about why a defendant may not have committed a crime, we want to maybe reprocess that data again, looking to see if there's any additional information that the software now reads through. We've seen many times where additional databases have become available within cases, which we did not have access to at the outset of the case. So next slide, please. So kind of towards the end, as we get closer to a trial, what I always want to get to is, does the data that I'm looking at tell a story? And what is that? If it does tell a story, what does that story look like? Data doesn't lie. It's one of those things that gets kind of hard to look at, but it can certainly be misinterpreted. There are many times where we've looked at different things, and then as we get more information, our initial assumptions have been proven not accurate. One of the main things we always look at is, does the data confirm or contravene your theory of events? As we look at the map to the side, this is a map that I created several years ago that it's really difficult to see, but in essence, there's a murder that's labeled kind of towards the top right of the map. All of the events happen on this map within about 5 minutes of each other. The person who's there's a person who's there's a person who's identified as being the shooter in this murder, who's arrested, and he says that he wasn't there, that he's home doing something else with somebody else. We were able to get his phone. The big problem was that we had multiple people say that he was the one that committed the shooting. As we take a look at his device and we look and see that there's pictures that support what he had to say in his interview about where he was at and what he was doing, to make sure that we weren't looking at something where the device could have been edited, the GPS information, which is labeled in the center. We also got call detail records from the device. All of the calls and text messages and the photographs that are labeled on this map all occur within a few minutes of the murder that definitely show that this person was not at the location of the shooting. One of the questions that was asked earlier today by Cathee was, how do we know that this is the person that, that somebody else wasn't using this device? Well, the pictures that were geotagged and also time and date stamped were selfies and they also showed exactly what he said he was doing at that time. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, because now that we've kind of talked about some of the different things that we can do, how do we present it at trial?
And if we could go back one slide, just it's not hugely important, but how we use that and how data can't be or it can be misinterpreted, but it doesn't lie. I mean, in the context, especially of the cases I work, the domestic violence cases, sex assaults on children, things like that. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a huge part of our cases, a huge part of what we're going into trial with, is the credibility of our victim, witnesses, things like that. So where this can be helpful, you know, in the context of domestic violence, we've had violation of protection order or restraining order cases before, where you know, the victim may have actually invited the person over earlier in the day. That, you know, as I'm sure everyone's aware, in the domestic violence context, the victim and the defendant may not always be in the same moment of when a crime occurs, and they could be at a good portion of that cycle of violence. It's very helpful to know ahead of time, essentially, that when we're going into a case, even though certainly a protection order isn't excused by an invitation from the victim earlier in the day, it's still very helpful to know that that's there, and that that's something that we're going to have to combat. Another thing that you know, we look at is when we're doing our witness and victim interviews in preparation for trial. You know, one of the things I certainly talk to them about is, you know, I'll explain to them that we have this information, if we do, the digital information, just to essentially preclude them from reasonably trying to convey a story to us that gets rid of all of what they think might be negative and maintain their credibility. The last thing I want is to sit down with an investigator and have a victim or a witness say, no, I didn't invite him over or her over, the defendant. And then ultimately at the end of the day, we have the data from their phone or the defendant's phone with the text messages saying that they did absolutely invite them over. So I tend to show them and alert them of the fact that we know that right from the get-go, to preclude them from getting into reasonable but denials that the defense at trial, once we create memos and things like that that we discover, would be able to use to attack their credibility. And then finally, what I would say is that nowadays, especially with any case that I go into trial with, I have a serious concern with digital evidence. Even if we don't have it, the fact that the defense, if they're doing a good job, if it's a good defense attorney, the defense certainly has digital evidence if they choose to use it. So again, where credibility is so huge, and we want to work with our witnesses and our victims, I like to, you know, I want to go into trial with as much as I can to combat things, and I will just flat out, you know, tell my witnesses and my victims, every conversation you've had or any conversation you've had with the defendant, the defense has, either through their own records or if they got their phone back, things like that. So it's incredibly important, in my opinion, to be mindful of the digital evidence, because even in the cases where we don't have it, the defense may have it, and we need to absolutely think about what are we going to get into trial, that, you know, all of a sudden they'll get to pick and choose what pieces of a text message they want to show from the victim or from a witness or something like that. And I think, you know, as a prosecutor, we need to be aware of the fact that even if we think our case doesn't have digital evidence, that the defense is going to be using digital evidence as they have the defendant's phone to impugn the credibility of any of our witnesses.
Next slide, please. Thank you. I think we're now going to move on to topic 5, which is the last topic of this 2-part seminar. And basically, we've covered, again, how to get the evidence, how to collect it, how to search it, now how to analyze it. Now that all of that has happened, the next thing you need to know is how to present it effectively at trial. And I would like to note, too, sometimes having that evidence actually precludes the necessity of a trial. Someone may decide to go to trial until they realize that they have, the prosecution has text messages implicating them where they perhaps confess to the crime, or we have other digital evidence that basically takes away their defense. And so it's not just digital evidence and how you can use it at trial that is a benefit to having that digital evidence. It's also how you can use it to essentially create a situation where the motivation for going to trial isn't there, because they know that basically we got them. We got the smoking gun. And so next slide, please. So basically in this one, we're going to talk about traditional, we're not going to talk too much about traditional visual exhibits, but it's important when we talk about digital evidence, we talk a lot about cell phones, and we talk about social media, and we talk about call detail records. But traditional visual exhibits are also forms of digital evidence. We've got surveillance video, 911 and jail calls, crime scene photos, interrogations, and interviews. Those are all still very much a big part of a criminal case, and they are used frequently, and they are also should be considered when you're determining how to effectively present your evidence at trial, in terms of maybe clips from videos, portions of 911 or jail calls, and things like that. Next slide, please. Some of the evidence to consider, though, of the digital evidence, what we're talking about now, are social media images and posts. We get a lot of Facebook Messenger messages that are very, very incriminating. Sometimes we have too many and we have to cull them down to figure out which ones we want to use, so we don't spend what should be a 2 or 3 day trial into a 3-week trial. Text messages and emails. We don't see too many emails, but sometimes we do. Text messages and instant chats are often a big part of the visual evidence to consider. And then, as Chris showed you in his some of his past speaking a few minutes before this, and then in some of the case studies he's going to present here, location-based exhibits and simulations are also very helpful. But before you decide I'm sorry, next slide, please. Before you decide what you're going to present at trial, you have to really get back to the law, and you have to decide, is the evidence that you're going to present relevant to the issues in the case? You can't just put a picture up on the screen that shows the person in some sort of derogatory fashion or something embarrassing if it's not relevant to the issues of the case. And even relevant evidence can be excluded if its probative value is substantially outweighed by the danger of undue prejudice. So you've got to deal with those, and I didn't put the state, most of the rules from many jurisdictions in the federal rules, 401, 402 deal with relevance, and then 403 deals with that balancing of even if it's relevant, it might still be unduly prejudicial and therefore not admissible. So when you're putting together exhibits that is depicting this digital evidence and the visual evidence that you want to use, make sure that this is evidence that is admissible and based on evidence that either has been or will be properly admitted at trial, because you definitely don't want to have an exhibit that hasn't been discussed or admitted at trial. Next slide, please.
As far as editorial commenting goes, and specifically what we mean here are these images where the words are added to the images. This is something I think is incredibly, you got to be incredibly careful with. And realistically speaking, from a prosecutorial standpoint, the only time that I would ever add anything like this would be in closing arguments. Personally, I personally would not use this tactic, but I have seen and can understand why it could be useful. But you know, if you have an exhibit that has already been entered and then later in a closing argument, which is, you know, obviously argument, you wanted to add in the theory of your case or something like that, or why all of your evidence equals a picture of the defendant with guilty over his face. But I think the only time that could ever be potentially used is in closing argument, at least with this type of editorial commenting.
Next slide, please. So in addition to relevance and admissibility, one of the important things also that is going to have to consider legally before you can introduce the digital evidence is making sure you have authenticated it. And the ultimate touchstone of authentication is the evidence what we are saying it is? There's many, many methods of authentication. The rules are filled with ways of evidence being self-authenticated, but if you don't fall into one of those self-authenticated methods, think about different ways that you can show it is what you are saying it is. If it's a text message, the defendant's admission in the text message, you know, using his name, even if it's direct or indirect, comments made relating to certain evidence, that you have independent evidence showing that he was linked to that evidence. Witnesses, other witnesses can testify that they've communicated with the defendant on that phone or using that number or by that email or through that social media account in the past. The defendant telling a witness, or the witness just knowing that that number belongs only to the defendant and that's the only person that uses it. It's going to be up to the judge to decide if that's enough. So the more you can do to give to the judge to show it is what you're saying it is, you're going to need to do that to authenticate all of your digital evidence that you admit at trial. Next slide.
And just continuing on with that authentication, you know, necessity, authentication by reply, where essentially a message is replied to by the defendant or by a witness. You know, specifically in the DV context, we often have to authenticate things that aren't necessarily just the defendant. It could be the victim if we're trying to go on a case without a victim, if he or she is not cooperative. But that, you know, those context clues by reply can certainly get you to your authentication. And then authentication by circumstances, we have, you know, we've had situations before where names, things like that, nicknames, only things that would apply or reasonably would apply to the defendant or to whoever is speaking in the digital evidence are used to get to that authentication. And then to that last point, where we're talking about any other evidence that shows that it was the defendant using the device. I mean, authentication, in my opinion, you know, there's all kinds of other ways or other things that you'll need to get that in. But as far as showing authentication, you really can get relatively creative on how to authenticate things. We've had situations where, like a 911 call, I've had a detective on the stand when a victim didn't show, who will say, you know, this is her voice. I spoke to her on multiple occasions, and this is exactly what she relayed to me. And then, you know, from a call record, we know that she made that call during that time. So, you know, I like to make the argument at some point it goes to the weight, not the admissibility, and authentication you can get pretty creative with.
One thing I'd like to add just before we move on to the next slide is authentication and attribution can be overlapping concepts, and their authentication is usually determined in assessing the admissibility of evidence, but authentication is also important to show attribution or vice versa. Attribution is basically not just is it what it says it is, but who made that post, who typed that text, who made that phone call. And so some of these same methods that we use for authentication can be used for attribution, and attribution is what the jury's going to want to know. And how do we attribute that incriminating, that smoking gun text, that incriminating video or photo to the particular person that we want to attribute it to. And so it's important to understand that authentication and attribution, there's a lot of overlap. Authentication is the legal concept. It's required for the evidence to be admissible, but a lot of these same strategies can be applied for attribution as well. Okay, next slide.
And then as far as hearsay goes, you know, you have all of the exceptions to hearsay in the 800, 801s, 803. You know, obviously in the digital evidence realm, we use admission by a party opponent a ton. If we have statements from the defendant's phone in 911 calls for victims, we use present sense impression or excited utterance all the time, state of mind. One thing I would add to this list, and it is, you know, jurisdiction specific. I know Colorado has now, as of June, a forfeiture by wrongdoing statute, but most jurisdictions do have forfeiture by wrongdoing. Our forfeiture by wrongdoing statute now allows us, that is per statute now, an exception to hearsay. So it gets us around confrontation and hearsay in Colorado. So I would definitely suggest, in addition to these rules, enumerated exceptions to hearsay, looking at your forfeiture by wrongdoing statutes, or at least the doctrine, to see what and how you can potentially get in evidence through that doctrine as well.
So John, at this point, I'd like to skip 2 slides ahead to case study number 1. And Chris is going to talk about 2 cases that he handled in the Denver courts and involved how the case was analyzed and also how it was presented at trial.
So thanks. So we'll go through these kind of quickly because they're fairly lengthy, and these are both examples of what we've used at trial with multiple sources of data, with sitting down and talking to the juries and presenting this in front of a jury, and then in both cases we're able to get a positive verdict for our office. This first case here, this is it's going to be a little difficult because I don't have control over this, but I want to just say we'll go through this kind of quickly to show exactly what it is that we put in front of the jury. The first page here shows kind of what records I analyzed, what all the totals that were in there. So this particular case, there's 1,260 records, of which 16 are analyzed in there. And then also on top of that, there was some GPS data that was included with it. I like to put in the total numbers. One of the attorneys in the office likes to show kind of everything that's there. And his argument is usually like, out of all of these records, you're telling me you found these 4 things, and just kind of, you know, making the jury think that it's a kind of a bigger deal. Go ahead and move forward. So the carriers, they provide us with this information. And I know John is doing this. If you can move forward just every couple of seconds, I think we'll be okay. I put up in front the subscriber records, also the call detail records, anything that I used for the analysis in order to present to the jury and show them what the information that I'm getting looks like, on top of the notion that, you know, this is me up there talking, but the carriers also tell me exactly what each of those fields mean. We put up the tower records in front of the jury to say, you know, it's not me just saying that this antenna or the cell tower is there. It's also the carrier that's saying that it's there. With the GPS records, I think on this slide, it's not me saying that the defendant in this particular case had the records on there. It's the place that we got the data from that's saying that this is where the records are at. So in these cases, this particular case was a series of street robberies that were occurring in Denver. They occurred over the course of, I believe, a couple of months, and then finally culminating in a homicide where, in all of these cases, this particular defendant was wearing a GPS monitor. As we move forward through the case, this is a much larger rendition of a map that we saw earlier. Like I said, we put this in front of the jury, and I like to show everything that we're looking at kind of at once. I'm looking at all of the addresses that are relevant to the case, all of the GPS points that are relevant to the time frame and to the case, the cell towers that are being used that are relevant to the case, and not directly relevant, but all of the cell towers in the immediate area, because then we're showing, you know, out of all the choices that are in the area for this phone to make as far as which antenna to use, it chose this one. And then we kind of go through, as we talked a little bit about timelines, we go through just a sequence of events as they occur. Next slide, please. And so you'll see that at the top we have it labeled by the date and then the time frame that we're looking at. This particular one, you start to see that the GPS points will start to kind of come together with the victim's phone. Next slide. And you can see, if you look at the green labels, you can see that the device is moving chronologically towards the south, and it starts to overlap with the wedges, the cell tower usage. That this right here, these two pieces of data points show that the defendant in our case and the victim are in roughly the same area at the same time. And you can see them coming together. As we move forward, we start to see some kind of zoom in information. There was a lot of explaining how the systems work and how this information works in order to get it to this point. Go ahead and go forward. And then we also see travel paths. So you see the star in the center. That's the location of where the homicide occurred, or where the victim's body was found. This is a great example because it shows how the defendant was moving prior to the robbery, how they came up on the robbery. Since he's wearing a GPS, the information that was presented by the other victims, there were 3 victims total, only one was murdered. The other 2 victims gave a good statement, and the GPS device confirmed nearly the identical fact pattern of what one of the victims had said. In addition to that, we put the time and date down at the bottom so we can show here's the time and date of these references, here's the latitude, longitude, the number of satellites that were being connected, and the speed. All of that information for the jury, because of the information that comes in through your foundational witnesses, were greatly assisted, because we had somebody to come in and talk about their GPS, the product itself, and say, yeah, you have to have 4 satellites to connect up, but also the more satellites that you connect to on GPS, the better the results are. We have 9 satellites that are connecting up, and I think the max on this device was 11. So 9 out of 11 devices connect up mysteriously at the point in time when this homicide occurs. And then as we move forward, after the homicide, the suspects took the victim's phone, and we see that the GPS and the phone usage start tracking together as we move southbound down I-25 in Denver. On the next one, it shows another overlay. And you can see that the phone is conducting automated transactions with the network. And this is something that we had to talk about with the jury, because the phone, obviously the victim was in an ambulance. He was on his way to the hospital by this time, but the phone is still registering on the network, and it's still conducting automated transactions across the network. We're able to kind of make a general estimate of where the phone may be during those automated transactions. And from this, we see that the GPS device is overlaid directly on top of where we assume that the phone was, showing that one of the things that one of the statements was that the suspects, when they committed the robbery, they took the victim's phone. So that's why we were looking at this data. So as we move forward, we'll go a little bit kind of quicker. That's just the murder. We then see the device going back up to the suspect's house, and then that's kind of the end of it, where we see that the suspects at home, along with the usage of the phone being consistent with the area of the suspect's house. So I don't recall if we were able to collect the phone in this case. I don't remember if it was disposed of prior to them going home or not, to be honest with you. We also, right after testifying to this piece of it, we also put in front of the jury all the GPS records related to the other street robberies that had occurred, kind of in a similar fashion, going through and putting the defendant at each of the different locations, again, showing all of the data that we're going to put in front of the jury. This one looks a little different because it was an investigative map that was created before we filed the cases. And then setting that timeline, looking at how things are operating. And as we talked a little bit about what can we confirm or can we contravene our theories of the case, not only can we do that, but we can also confirm or contravene what witnesses are telling us or what victims are telling us. In each of these cases, except for one, the data that was presented or shown from the GPS and the data that was put in front of the jury was nearly identical to what the victims had to say about the events that occurred when they were robbed and where they were robbed. This label here is a little bit off as to where the location of the robbery is, but that's because of the mapping software. When we talk to the victim, they say they were about mid-block in the Dakota area, where we see the GPS device hitting right around just a few minutes before the 911 calls are made. Again, this is going to be the same information as we go through events on September 29th and again on October 11th. And we can just kind of move through these. There's really not much of a change in how they're presented. It's more of what can we get out of the data and what can we use when we get to trial to put in front of the jury to show what happened. In addition to everything else, the part of these guys' MO is they were taking wallets during the robbery. They were also taking phones. This particular defendant took somebody's credit card. They used the credit card at a liquor store, or tried to use the credit card at a liquor store. So we were able to get video evidence, put that into the presentation in front of the jury. Now we've got a picture of somebody that's on a GPS device. And if we move to the next slide, we show where that GPS device is. And it just happens to be that liquor store where we have the defendant on video. So now I've got multiple sets of confirmations in the data, putting defendant in multiple places. And in my experience in the juror's mind, as you add those pieces together and you're kind of building a cake essentially of information, that helps them to relate exactly what's going on. And it also corrects for any issues that may have arisen during the data collection phases that are all automated. The next case that we'll look at is, again, unfortunately, it's another homicide, but you'll see that it's set up in a very similar fashion as far as how we present the information to the jury. We talk about what records are provided by the carrier. We talk about, having to convert all those times from if they're presented in universal coordinated time, how I go about that process. And then again, showing that this isn't just me saying all this stuff. This is what AT&T is telling me their data means. We talk about how does a cell tower work? How does your phone work in relation to the antennas? How is it that we're able to locate a device, a general area of a device based on what the records are showing us? What the construction of a cell tower may or may not look like, or roughly what it looks like. And then getting into the records. Again, I like to show the records because then it kind of shows that, this is just a big set of numbers and we're going to create some nice little pictures out of the numbers. As we go forward, this particular case, we have not only, as we get a little bit further into it, we've got several different locations that are a part of it. We also have phone dumps that are a part of this case, which were enormously helpful in showing how these three particular parties came together. This presentation is only one out of the three that we put in front of the jury, but as we get a little bit closer, we're going to see, or a little bit further along, we'll see that some text messages are going to start to show up at the bottom. I believe there are 2 more slides. Yeah, there you go. So what we see in these slides at the bottom is a blending again of multiple sources of data. We've got, if you think about layering on the map itself, you've got the base map, you've got the locations of all the antennas, you've got the addresses of interest, and you've got the wedge shape showing the rough location of where the phone was being used. We were also able to include in that the text messages that were received off of a phone extraction. And you see on the prior, go ahead and go back to the prior slide, you see the one before that says you should go ahead and come pick me up. This one says, okay, we're on our way. The one that is not highlighted is the one that's related to the red wedge shape. If we go to the next one, you'll see that they go to the home, and then the next one, you'll see 2 more. And there you go. You'll see now, hey, we're outside, come out here, and we'll move on to where we're going. Again, that confirmed some of the events of the night as the detectives were conducting their interviews. They said that this girl and her boyfriend left the North Denver area, went down and picked up this guy. From here, they end up going over to the homicide location. Her phone stops. What we see in the data as far as the other 2 devices is the continuation of the pattern of movement into the area of the homicide. Move forward a little bit. One of the things that I wanted to, John, if you can move forward to the next one. I'm sorry. Go back one. And one more. There we go. So this becomes kind of important because we see that there's no calls or text messages, at least in this case. And that kind of highlights one of the things that I like to put up as well when I'm doing my analysis and also talking to the lawyers is just as important as what's within the records is what's not within the records, what's not within your data, and how can you find what's missing. What became one of the more important things that became in this case was in one of the phone extractions that we had, we didn't really have any communications between our main suspect and the victim. When we pull the records from AT&T, we see that there's over 1,200 communications between the two of them. And that was when we highlighted that for the jury to show what the difference was between what was actually found in the phone and what AT&T was collecting. That was it was pretty illustrative of what some of the issue was, especially when he says, I don't know that guy, I never met that guy. And then we can show that there's a lot of voice calls and there's a lot of text messages between you two. So we can show that he was lying about that. We use these PowerPoints. So, and I'm gonna let Cathee talk about how we use some of these, the PowerPoints in a little bit more detail.
So, but the use of PowerPoints, I mean, some people nowadays frown on PowerPoints. There's lots of different, I think, platforms that you can look at. And if you're a trial lawyer or you give presentations, you can look at some of these PowerPoints and some of these tools that can be really effective, because I think one thing studies often show, not everybody, but a lot of people process material better visually than simply by hearing about the bare facts. Certainly we have to have, in a criminal trial, we have to have the facts as part of the records, but it's also helpful for the jury to see things visually. But again, as I indicated before, with the relevance and the admissibility, we have to make sure we only use materials that have been or will be admitted at trial. Stay away from mugshots or altered photos, or as Matt talked about with the editorial comments on the photos, be very careful with those. And avoid argumentative slides, particularly during opening statement. You can use those, get away with those more in closing argument because it's argument. Opening statement is supposed to be just simply an indication. So I don't see too many PowerPoint presentations being used in opening statements. Do you, Matt?
The only PowerPoint that I generally will use a PowerPoint in an opening statement would be a timeline. I think that's really conducive to telling the story and outlining the facts in an opening statement. So that's generally where I would see a PowerPoint used.
Did you have a timeline case that you found that it was particularly helpful to use a timeline?
I had one. This goes back to Cathee's point earlier about why digital evidence could actually help us not go to trial. But I had one where the defense essentially, it was an aggravated robbery, and the defendant and his co-defendant were actually allowed to leave the scene, so we never got the gun. We did, however, 2 months later get his phone, which provided us about a year's worth of photos of this guy and his love story with the gun. And when the defense essentially saw what was going to be the opening statement timeline telling the story of this defendant with his gun, it ended up pleading. So I didn't actually get to use it at trial, but it was super helpful in at least the idea of, he was going to argue that the victim was wrong and never saw this gun. The victim described it pretty well. And then we have essentially photos for like 6 months before the event, 6 months after the event, of this man and his gun, and how he basically always had it with him. The idea that he didn't have it with him on that day when he went there to fight this guy seemed a little implausible at that point.
Great. Next slide. One of the things, and this is going to be, John, one of the things we'll just kind of go through some of these slides. If you want to go ahead and get all the ones going on this slide. One of the things that can be effective, we have probably 4 more clicks on this one. One of the things that can be effective in these PowerPoints is showing comparisons and compilations of photos with important details highlighted. You could overlay, so you could see if someone was describing the two vehicles on the left or clearly from a surveillance video of some sort, and then the two videos on the left, on the pictures on the right, show the car once it was seized. And so you can compare things and show the shape of the, let's say, the headlights and the slope of the roof and where certain things are on a car that can show this was the car involved in the crime. Next slide, please. You can also do that with clothing. Go ahead and just throw all these ones up there. This was a case where the pictures all surrounding the sweatshirt that's in the middle. The sweatshirt, ultimately we were able to get the sweatshirt, but all the others were surveillance video. So you can imagine how a slide like this could be compelling, because what is the chances of someone wearing a sweatshirt that has all of these specific details that are exactly the same? It also helped that it was his son's baseball team sweatshirt. So having those pictures and then comparing them using these arrows and these boxes to overlay and show the comparisons, it can be really helpful in a PowerPoint, particularly in closing argument. The next slide. Also with the defendant's shoes, we can do the same thing. I had a case once where, not quite sure why, but during a 7-Eleven robbery, a suspect wore neon multicolored tennis shoes to commit a robbery, and then went down the street and committed another robbery and wore neon multicolored tennis shoes. And so we didn't even have to make this kind of comparison because the kind of shoes were so unique. But here you can point out certain things like the soles, like little markings on the side. I mean, obviously not, lots of people wear Nikes, lots of people wear Adidas, lots of people wear different shoes, but sometimes there's specific things you can point out. And especially when you're combining it with other similarities between what you see in surveillance videos, such as the shoes and the jacket and the sweats, things like that, or the baseball hat, that could be really compelling. Next slide. So closing argument is a perfect point to do a PowerPoint because you can take all those different types of visual evidence to establish the strength of your case. Next slide. This is one example that Chris is going to go talk about. It was a case he was involved in, and one of our deputies did a fantastic job with Chris putting together this PowerPoint and putting together the data. There is one slide in here. There's nothing in here that shows anything that we would need to warn you about, other than this was a robbery. It was a homicide. There is no pictures of the victim or any gory pictures, but there is a picture of the vehicle that was shot up. But this is just a way to show in a PowerPoint how compelling all the evidence is, and we have multiple different types of evidence that were useful in this case. So Chris, if you want to talk about this case a little bit.
Sure. So this is, like Cathee said, this is a murder. This is almost a domestic, but it's really more gang related than anything else. As they went through the closing arguments, after all the testimony and everything was done, this is the information that was put up in front of the jury. So this was used to show some of the connections in the case and do some of those comparisons. So in this particular one, what we see is that when this person, you see him in the picture walking out of the McDonald's, when this person's arrested, he says to the detective during his interview, "Hey, I was at McDonald's." Well, yes, he was. We have that at McDonald's on the surveillance images showing that he was leaving. Next, we use the attorneys used the text messages that were showing the defendant's knowledge that a shooting was about to happen. For approximately 5 minutes before the shooting occurs, you see the message from Eli to Nisi that says, "Get out of the car." At some point, she responds back, "I can't, he's rolling." And she was in the vehicle with the victim. And the next slide, you see that he says, "No, you need to get out right now." And this is just a few minutes before the shooting occurs. On the next slide, we have a picture of the vehicle that was shown in front of the jury, as well as the definition of after deliberation, so that they could be aware of what type of judgment that they were going to use. The next slide kind of shows, not only do we have the data and the text messages that occur before the homicide happens, we have after. We have some more communications that are after the homicide that says you should ask, this particular one, so you better ask at least baby daddy what my hollows feel like, referring to hollow point guns or hollow point bullets. Those are the exact type of shells that were used at the murder scene. I believe this picture was taken, I don't remember if it was taken from a phone or if it was taken from the gun. Either way, this is a piece that's relevant to the case. The next slide, please. We have a comparison of what the defendant told somebody else, and then also how is that supported by independent and physical evidence. The defendant tells somebody that, or we're told he told me that he did the shooting, and we have a text message that says, ask her baby daddy how my hollows feel. We have somebody that says that Terrell, who's the victim, had a .38 in the car. Officers found a .380 in the car. He was told that the shooters walked to the window first and tried to fire. We see that all the gunshots at the crime scene were through the windows on the driver's side. They said that he used a 9mm. Everything was a 9mm that was found on the crime scene. One bullet popped out or was jacked. There was one live round that was found on scene, consistent with being ejected from the gun on scene, and so on. So you can see that there's a comparison between what our defendant told somebody else who testified to the information, and then you see what we can compare with the physical evidence, and you can use that in your closing arguments to even further solidify the argument that you're trying to make.
Next slide. So this is an example of something that you could do that doesn't really involve digital evidence, but it is in a way using distance and space to show that the defendant's theory of what happened, it cannot be plausible. So it's almost like, you know, old-fashioned digital evidence, old-fashioned surveillance video, where we're kind of almost recreating the incident. And in these next two slides, we can go through pretty quickly. What they did is they taped out the lobby of an apartment building where someone shot another person's going through one of the doors, and it showed how small the area was. So it made it less likely that the person who was doing the shooting couldn't see and didn't know who they were shooting at. You can go ahead and move close to the next slide. And one more slide. And what I want to end with, and I'm going to give a little disclaimer before we play this video. It's important not to forget in all of our rush to use digital evidence, use phones, use social media, which is just a gold mine these days, is not to forget the good old-fashioned digital evidence, surveillance video, jail phone calls, things like that. This case was a sexual assault case that happened in a dormitory in Denver. I do want to give a little, there is no images of the victim being sexually assaulted in this case at all. I just wanted to indicate that there is some images of the victim as she was unconscious, but there is nothing. So if you'd rather not see that, we can go ahead and you can leave. This is the second to last slide. This is just an absolutely compelling video, because basically what it was a case where these young people went out partying, and they drank, and they went back to the dorm. They brought the victim back to her room where she laid down and went to sleep. And as you can see from the video before it's even played, you can see people in the middle, and these are some of their friends getting ready to go back out. And you can see the suspect up in the right corner of the video. He's kind of peeking out, which is where his dorm room was. Go ahead and play the video.
Oh. It doesn't look like it.
Maybe we can use one of your expertise to explain what codec unavailable means and how these challenges get surmounted in middle of trial.
Well, I'm not. That's why we have Megan with us.
Did you send the PowerPoint PowerPoint to him, but not the video?
I said the whole PowerPoint. Okay. Well, basically what we see in this video, and I could just describe it, is we see that you can, the nice thing about this picture is we can see the suspect out in the top corner. That's where John has the arrow. And in the middle, he's waiting until his friends leave. And the victim's room is towards the front on the same side, right where that arrow is or that hand is. And so ultimately, when the suspect hears that the friends are gone, he walks down to the victim's room, and you can see the surveillance video of him carrying the victim back down to his room. He goes into his room, and she is clearly unconscious. She's asleep. And so his later claim that she came to his room and it was a consensual sexual encounter was just clearly defeated by the video in this case. And so the lesson here is just that don't forget your surveillance video, don't forget your 911 phone calls, your jail phone calls. Think about how you can mash those and overlay those with each other in your PowerPoints to make an effective PowerPoint or to make an effective closing argument demonstration to prove your point. And that is what we have. The next slide is just our names and our office phone number. You can reach out to any of us if you have any questions. Is there any questions right now? I don't see any in the Q&A session or the Q&A, but we're pretty much right at time. So I'd like to thank AEquitas for having us. Sorry for all the technical difficulties today, but I think we got it straightened out a little bit and got all the information across. Both of these videos will be available. And thank you again, John, and thanks to my colleagues, the amazing Chris Gray, crime analyst, Matt Scheiger, who's an incredible trial attorney, and Adam Bechtold, who's just one of the best criminal investigators and now forensic examiners that I could be lucky to work with.
Cathee, Adam, and Chris and Matt, I want to thank the four of you for such an informative presentation and really edifying us with all these great ideas and inspiration. Thank you for the four of you, not only for what you've done in this presentation, but for the work you do generally in your community and for our greater community at large. Folks, we are about 4 minutes from 3:30 Eastern time, 12:30 Mountain time. So if there are any questions, we'd be happy to take them. However, being before weekend starts, it's no crime if we end early. We're permitted to do that if everyone would like. Okay, for the good of the order, I don't see any questions coming, so we'll adjourn this presentation. Thank you so much for the four of you, and I really enjoyed it, and happy to catch up on it when it's recorded too.
Thank you, and thank you all for attending.
I'm going to wait till everyone leaves the room just in case any hiccups pop up, but thank you both.